Good evening and welcome. I'm Susan Galassi, Senior Curator at the Frick Collection, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Conrad Shawcross, the acclaimed British sculptor and member of the Royal Academy since 2013. His work, which explores the intersection of art and science, is well known throughout England, Europe, and Asia, and is bursting on the scene on this side of the Atlantic at this point as well. Tonight's talk is part of the Artists, Poets, and Writers lecture series that was set up in 2004 to bring contemporary perspectives of leading creative individuals to the Frick Collection. This program has been funded from the outset by the Drue Heinz Trust. We are profoundly grateful to Mrs. Heinz, who died in March at 103, for her generosity and steadfast support, and for the interest she took in the talks. It was always fascinating to discuss ideas for potential speakers with her, given her deep involvement with generations of artists and writers. One of the artists she particularly admired is our speaker tonight. I would like to thank Julia Shea, Managing Director of the Drue Heinz Trust, for her collaboration throughout the series. Thanks are due as well to Anne Cottingham, manager of the Shawcross Studio, for her help in organizing tonight's event. Conrad Shawcross is one of the most ambitious young artists working today. He makes technologically complex and extraordinarily beautiful abstract sculpture in various media, often on a monumental scale. The themes of his work are generally drawn from scientific ideas, nature, music, and philosophy. He attributes his interdisciplinary approach in part to his childhood. As the son of two distinguished writers and the stepson of a painter, he grew up in a world of art and ideas while discovering his own innate passion for making things and taking things apart. Later, at the Ruskin School of Art, a part of Oxford University, his exposure to fields such as English literature, history, and the sciences was crucial in shaping his art practice. Conrad Shawcross's work is often compared to scientific models or machines, and his creative process has much in common with industrial production. From initial sketches, he works with a firm of structural engineers to create prototypes that are then fabricated by his large studio in East London. The end result, however, is work that is poetic and playful, exploring the nature of reality and the limits of perception. As he puts it, his primary goal is to chisel away at the sense of reality and to create work that is unnerving. Mr. Shawcross's dynamic public and private monuments provoke our senses and engage our minds, often eliciting visceral responses. His gravity-defying sculpture, Paradigm, a column of stacked steel tetrahedrons, raises from a narrow base in a precarious twist near the Francis Crick Institute in London. Will it topple over, we wonder as we walk by? Further afield at Greenwich, his enormous optic cloak, a 160-foot faceted aluminum sheath that disguises the flue system of the Greenwich Energy Center, is an extraordinary shimmering presence on the horizon. Yet optical illusions and camouflage in the surfaces of the piece make it seem to dissolve as the viewer moves, creating the kind of tension between visibility and disappearance that Shawcross loves to exploit. Two major exhibitions present Mr. Shawcross's work at the moment. Victoria Miro Gallery in London highlights his new fracture sculptures made of mirrored steel. And closer to us, the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, Connecticut, is presenting Shawcross's first solo exhibition in America, surveying his art of the last 5 years in sculptures, models, and related drawings. Just this week, Elephant Publishing brought out the first monograph on his work. And tomorrow, a monumental Shawcross work for the lobby of the new Comcast Technology Center in Philadelphia designed by Norman Foster, will be presented to the public with the opening of parts of the building. It is a privilege to have Conrad Shawcross here at the Frick, where sculpture plays a major role in our collection at this critical moment in his career. Please join us for a reception in the garden court following the lecture. And now, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a lovely introduction. And thank you very much for having me here today and for the Trust for inviting me over for this, this prestigious talk. I'm trying to, I usually give quite a broad sort of spectrum of my practice, but I'm trying to sort of hone it down and just really talk about two ongoing disparate aspects of my practice that have been sort of with me for many years, but have sort of tried to, which have now sort of merged together, so they've sort of kind of mutated and kind of been spliced together after being these sort of parallel kind of ventures. But before I do that, I was just going to just show you a few sort of early works to give you some sort of context of my practice 20 years ago. So this is like one of my first pieces I made at the art school. It's called Yarn. And I made, most of my things were made of wood then. I made everything with carpentry and joinery. It was my kind of, my medium, the thing I was most sort of satisfying doing. And I made everything on my own. I tinkered, and all the sort of engineering and all the parts were all sort of just thought up and just drawn on the backs of envelopes in my sketchbook. And so sort of this was the first piece I ever made that I sort of regard as a sort of finished work. And it's essentially a sort of rope machine, and it weaves a rope up to the top and travels around the spool, and so it's mechanically driven and it works, and they all spin in different directions. And it's, I guess, the sort of first sort of systems-based object that I made, and I think what's the sort of key thing to my work is it's all kind of based on a system of modular parts. It has a sort of an illusion of something quite rational, but actually it's sort of beneath that it's quite irrational. These then went on to form other kind of more sophisticated rope machines. This was in a tunnel underneath Holborn in London, where there were two machines that were weaving a rope very, very slowly away from each other, for very, very incrementally slowly. So they're traveling away, and they sort of, as they went down this sort of abandoned tunnel, they would illuminate the tunnel further and further. So they're like two spiders weaving their way slowly down this this space. Again, and there was sort of one primary arm and three secondary arms, 9 tertiary and 27 quaternary arms, and 162 spools. So immensely kind of complex systems on the point of sort of collapse or on the point of sort of not working. So I was always sort of attracted, drawn to these sort of complex systems and sort of machines, but also this idea of the sort of cloak of the rational. There's this sort of aesthetic of the machine that I was very much engaged with. This was, you may well have seen this. I don't know if you were in Madison Avenue, just around the corner from here, in the IMP space. This was in 2011. We put this this suspended rope machine from the ceiling of the IMP space, and so it very, very slowly, incrementally turned a rope down to the floor, which then gathered on the floor. It went round this winch, and the winch was motorized, so it was very, very slowly turning. So I guess with a sort of like a mobile at first, but also a kind of orrery or something. There's this sense of, I think when I first started making these machines, I saw them as a sort of model of time, and I was quite when I made that yarn piece, I thought this could be some sort of model of time. I was very naive. I was sort of I was 20 years old, and of course it wasn't a model of time, but it's a failed model of time. And it really shows up so this is a video of it. So I think what's interesting is that there's a sort of, it's about language. Let me just wait. So this is a tower we made. So the rope machine that was in Madison Avenue went from Madison Avenue to the Moudam in Luxembourg, and we couldn't hang it from the ceiling because it was too heavy. So in typical style, I just said, I'll just make a tower for it. And we sort of built this tower with a whole kind of gangway above with these raking shores and spiral staircases, and the children would jump in the rope below. So that's always a good sign, is when kids run to a work and dive into it. I'm always pleased that that's a sort of good demographic to please for a good sculpture. So I think the key thing with these machines is that at first they look like a rope machine and they're rationally built and there is this sort of this cloak of good design, but actually they're irrational, and that it makes a rope so slowly that it defies kind of it becomes very confusing, because all machines without fail really are made to do something faster than a human can do. So if you build a machine with all that rational intent and all that aesthetic kind of finesse and the authority of a machine, but then yet it does something slower than a human can, then it becomes very puzzling, quite disturbing. And this, I suppose, what I like, that I see this as a sort of failed model of time, and a lot of the works, I think, are these kind of failed models, but they sort of, by failing as models, they sort of succeed as artworks. Rather than answering questions, they ask them. I also made, this is another sort of branch of the work that was to do with harmonics, again, all made of wood, all 1 by 1 inch oak, all kind of painstakingly built. And this was a very fast, kinetic piece that basically drew out these toroidal knots of light. So there's a very fast spinning light bulb on the end of a series of arms, and they're all based on a ratio of 9:8, a 5:4, 3:2, and they just carve these in space. They sort of they extrude this toroidal knot, which is basically an expression of a musical chord. So this is 5 chords within the Western sequence. And this was called Loop System Quintet. So this was sort of to give you some background of all these sort of different sort of system-based objects. So on a sort of more formal level, rather than on this kinetic level, I was very interested primarily in the tetrahedron, because I started reading about it at university. And I was very interested in the tetrahedron as a building block. And from a philosophical point of view, the tetrahedron was the simplest of the Platonic solids. It was, and in ancient Greek times, it was the symbol of the very essence of matter. It was the symbol of the atom, which now we have a strange idea of, because the atom 170 years ago was named after a particle, and it's an example of how science got ahead of itself, because actually, quintessentially, the atom is an idea. It's a thing that can never be found. It's the indivisible unit of matter. And so the atom because we then subsequently divided the atom into smaller things, we should really retract the name, because it should be known, the atom formerly known as, or something, because it's a fallacy. So I was really interested in it as a symbol of this ultimate building block, and I wanted to find a sort of brick, like a rule-based thing, a little bit like a Solar Wit or a Carl Andre sculpture, where they use the cube or the brick as their building block. I decided to use the tetrahedron as my building block, but I was quite naive as to know why it was going to be very problematic to use this as a way of building, and there's a reason why no buildings are made of tetrahedrons, because it doesn't tessellate with itself, so it's quite an irrational shape. So I started experimenting with it in a very naive way, and I just was quite sort of gung-ho. I sort of made about 1,000 tetrahedrons and didn't know what the rules or the logics of the form at all. I didn't use any 3D modeling or anything, and I just sort of turned up at this castle called Sudeley Castle with these tetrahedrons and thought, I'll find the rules and the logics, and I'll build something from this, and I'll master this. But it was such a defiant form. It formed these sort of erratic tendrils that would never join onto itself, and so it was very plant-like. It was very unruly, and I was sort of baffled by it and sort of almost defeated by it. And so this is one of my most important sculptures, but I sort of regard it as a failure. But it's something. It was a sort of quintessential moment, because I was sort of trying to harness this thing, which I couldn't at that time, and I sort of left it for a while. But I was also kind of upset that there was no sort of hierarchy between the center and the outside. There was no sense of the outside was as big as the inside, and there wasn't this sense of entropy or decay or age, in that the oldest are the biggest and the youngest are the smallest. So there wasn't a sense of time within it, which was something that I was trying to convey. So after a while, I sort of started to toy around with developing a way that the tetrahedron, could diminish in size. You could have a cascade of scale throughout the system, but seamlessly. So you create a way that there is this expression of time, or of growth, or of expansion, or of essentially growth, a sort of natural element, but in this very geometric, in this very kind of engineered aesthetic. So this is this sort of example of these truncations which show 5 generations of tetrahedron growing. And I think what's nice about this, like a shell, there is a sort of ambiguity about which is the end and which is the beginning. Is the smallest the beginning, or is the end the beginning? Is it growing, is it spiraling inwards, or is it spiraling outwards? So there's this sort of ambiguity of the directionality of it in terms of a sense or an expression of time, and our ability to understand time through language. This then became this rather ambitious sculpture that I then produced for the Royal Academy courtyard. And I ended up making, and this is sort of slightly typical fashion, it's slightly foolhardy. Instead of sort of making one on the ground, I ended up making 5 of these with 24,000 tetrahedrons suspended on these tripods, having not made a prototype beforehand. So it was all a bit kind of scary. And it's on these very dainty legs, and it was called the Dappled Light of the Sun. And it was really about this idea of that universal idea of sitting underneath a tree, and that's that moment of serenity, maybe with a glass of wine, and you're watching that dappled light of the light on the ground, and you have that incredible awe at looking up at this tree above you, and you can imagine whether you sort of wonder whether you could ever, if you just from the shadows, you could envision or you could work out the structure of that tree. And it's sort of course, it's sort of that sort of Plato's cave analogy. So this one is really a sort of trying to sort of replicate that in a very geometric way, creating from very simple rules, creating complexity. And this, again, this was in a very different context. It's the same piece, but outside Chatsworth House. So it became very, very different I was very worried about putting this one in a landscape, but it actually worked very well. I was very worried about it competing with nature and failing. But actually, I really sort of almost preferred it having this relationship with it became very nimble, cloud nimbus-like. And I worked with a very hard-working, very exhausted structural engineer who helps me engineer these things, but the result of his sort of very hard work improving things through numbers is that these tripods, even though each sculpture weighs 5 tons, they're very, very these tripods are so slender that it feels almost like they're being tied down. So there's this incredible sort of attention to the sort of proportions, and that we both engage with together on a sort of very obsessive, proportional concern that there is this, just with the cascading diminishing of the sizes of the tetrahedrons. There's this all of these these quite Renaissance or quite old school rules of proportion and geometry that sort of drive our sort of thinking. So, but I think these pieces would be really destroyed if they were placed on really heavy stalks, and it's the slenderness of these that makes them almost feel like they're being tied to the ground rather than supported. And this was in Regent's Park in London. Outside the Frieze sculpture pair, and then another one in a garden in Italy. So there were 5 of them that we made, and they've gone into different places around the world. That's been quite nice to sort of have them, in very different places. And this is kind of my favourite context next to this pond. And then another shot of it at the Royal Academy, showing how these cascading tips emanate. So with this, there was one rule that within this kind of chaos of the tetrahedron that I discovered in this trip into when I did install this piece at Sudeley Castle. And if you install tetrahedrons in a certain order with a certain sequence, you can form this thing which Buckminster Fuller called the Tetra Helix, and it's a continuous, never-ending spiral, which is irrational, and it never repeats itself, so it never comes back full circle. It's a sort of irrational number, and then it doesn't, so it will never come back rotationally to the same point. And it's a bit like a sort of alien DNA or something. But out of all of this kind of chaos and this kind of disorder, there was this one beautiful, beautiful rule. And so, again, it was a sort of a thing that I can't say that I invented it. It's sort of a discovery. You unearth it. You find the rules within these pre-existing systems. It's a sort of like an eternal sort of phenomena. And so, again, this is another thing that I took. And this was a piece, this is one of my first commissions in London. It's in the Ministry of Justice in London. And it's a sort of pure tetrahedral tower. And it was very much about this idea of precariousness and collapse. And it's made of Douglas fir. And again, it's a very honest sculpture, and the wood is doing all the work. There's no metal frame supporting it. So the bottom tetrahedron is under immense amount of force. And it's 16 meters, so it's like 60 feet tall. But when I installed this, one of the things that I was a bit disappointed by was that there was this sense that the piece was diminishing as it went up, and the tetrahedrons were actually the same at the top as they were at the bottom, and it reminded me in my school days of sort of the Albertian tricks of architecture, how you would exaggerate the top of a facade in order for it to look square. And the same with the Apple computers in the 80s, the cube that Steve Jobs made. He would make them distorted in order to make them square, and so that it would compensate for the parallax of one's eyes. And so this piece always felt to me that it was a bit of an anticlimax, and that it was diminishing, even though it was making the same. So it made me realize that I wanted to try and exaggerate that, so that the tetrahedron would get bigger as it went up. So you'd have this compensation for parallax. That, of course, led on to sort of wanting to even extend that further. And so we then sort of created this parametric program that could allow us to create these sort of Babylonian towers that were very much about progress, but also about this sort of, about collapse. So they're sort of quite cautionary objects. And these are different parameters for how they would grow. So this is quite a slender one with a much smaller percentage growth. And then this is a much more extreme one, where it sort of really is there is this sort of apocalyptic element to it, where it really feels very, very unsustainable. And this is another iteration where we've sort of chamfered the edges and carved it. But again, it's subservient to this geometric, the geometry of the tetrahedron. There is this sort of this subservience to the tetrahedral rules, and then a structural one. So there was this rich sort of vein that came out of this sort of seam of work that sort of emerged from this discovery, and we made this array a few years ago at Victoria Miro in London. So it was this sort of field array of all these different iterations. So it was really really important to sort of see them all together, so you get this sense and through each other they define themselves. Rather than in isolation, they're sort of meaningless, but they become like musical notes. They define themselves against each other in opposition. The culmination of this was a piece called Paradigm, and this is outside the Francis Crick Institute, and it's one of my sort of proudest works in that it's a biomedical lab that is named after Francis Crick and Watson, who discovered DNA. It's not meant to be any reference to DNA. And in actually, ironically, one of the things they said when I was doing the competition was, we don't want a model of DNA. And it wasn't something that I was interested in. I was interested in this idea of paradigms and in terms of paradigm shifts, which is a thing that Thomas Kuhn coined. He's a philosopher of science, in that healthy science has to chisel away at old ideas of what is real. And sort of pre-given notions of what is real, and chisel away at these things. For healthy science to progress, it must attack and chisel away at these preconceptions. So there is this sort of idea of this mighty stack of tetroids, which if you were to add another one to, it may well collapse. So your argument at its most strong is also at its most vulnerable. And this is a different angle on it. Oh, sorry. So this is now sort of one of the next stage of this was that I was very fortunate a few years ago, and it was a kind of really amazing moment that I had within the show, there was this one slightly odd one out, which is this one on the right, which was this exploded paradigm where we'd kind of exploded the shell and then generated this helix inside it. And I was on, I think it was one of the last days of the show, I had Elena Foster and Norman Foster come to the show, and they came around the room. And at that time, I wasn't really sure about this work. I thought it was very new to me, and it was so different from the other one, but I liked it because it was an antidote to all the rusty works in the show. But there was something, it was still I was still absorbing it. But anyway, Norman and Elena came first, and then Norman came, and they saw this, and they had this building that was in Philadelphia that had this atrium, and I didn't know anything about this atrium, but there was this very strong feeling that this was potentially the right work for this atrium. So I flew out to New York, and I met the Comcast team and Brian Roberts, and we sort of basically made renders, and it all sort of happened very quickly. And it's very timely because tomorrow is the launch of this sculpture. That's my first commission in America. This is the study, which is quite a large study for it. So it shows all these chamfered mirrored panels. And then this is the piece. This is just taken a couple of weeks ago. So this is the piece in the ceiling. The unfortunate thing, there's a Jenny Holzer piece that's on the ceiling that's not illuminated in this shot. So there's a key interaction between this Holzer work, which tracks text along the ceiling, and the exploded paradigm, which sort of emerges as this sort of triumphant but precarious work, which reflects both the building and the Holzer. So there's a really interesting dialogue, but the more people are in the room, the more it kind of disrupts and breaks up the building, and you get these amazing kind of vistas and reflected sort of compound angles. But it was a huge feat of engineering. Again, my exhausted engineer is having to undertake these crazy projects. I learned to abseil to put this up. And I had to sort of descend to put the last three shields on, which are these huge 21-foot, 2-ton shields. I had to learn to abseil down through the sculpture and come down through this helical beanstalk and miss all the sharp corners of the shields. So it was quite a hairy job, but it was fantastic. So yeah, that's the last shot. And then there's trees in the winter garden, so it sort of reflects a lot of the different aspects of the space. So aside from this, parallel to this, I've developed this other thing which came about because of this really interesting problem, and I apologize for the quality of this slide. This is because this was taken from the PDF of the proposal. I was asked to compete in a competition. I just took this shot from the PDF of this proposal that came to me about 4 years ago, and it was a sort of problem that was put to 4 artists to solve. And this was a sort of low carbon energy center, and this silver sort of blade was a flue stack for 10 chimneys that were going to basically pump fumes up into the air, and it was going to basically be a low carbon energy center to provide 500 new homes, or so 5,000 new homes on the Greenwich Peninsula in London with low carbon energy. And they had this problem that they'd created this huge flue stack that looked a bit like a tombstone, and they wanted an artist to try and pretend that this wasn't a chimney, but an artwork. And it was this sort of, I was very worried about the commission in the sense that I didn't want to, it sort of felt quite political, and it was also, there was this 600-ton box around these flues, which could have been just left open. And the council had felt that the chimneys were a dirty word and that chimneys should be hidden, not seen. And I was sort of just worried about it because I just was worried about the disingenuousness of it. But and a few times I nearly wrote the email saying, I don't think I can do this, but I sort of then withdrew didn't send it because I was like, I've got to try and solve this. This is a really difficult problem, and I've got to put myself outside of my comfort zone and try and find a solution. So I made a pitch to them, which I didn't expect to win, but I said, look, we can't pretend it's not a chimney. We've got to remove this 600-ton box, because if we're going to be a low-carbon energy center, we can't just be putting a 600-ton box and then a huge sculpture on the side of it. We've got to be efficient and remove this frame and make a much more efficient frame and let the wind pass through it, and let's make it lighter and celebrate their chimneys. And so I came up with this idea that was basically a sort of skin, a sort of dynamic skin that basically because it was so thin, it was only 3 meters, only 9 feet deep, and it faced it east to west. I was very excited by the fact that the sun would rise and set behind it, and it had no flaws in it, so you could see up through it. So there was no sort of, we weren't the normal constraints that an architect would have, in that you had to sort of insulate it or do anything. It could just be open to the elements. So I was really interested in trying to create an interplay between the back and the front of it, and using the sun as the way to drive this change. So these are some tests of different sort of interference patterns of different holes within sheets that would basically play dynamically, and we did endless different tests of different interference patterns through these skin, and so these disruptive surfaces. And then that led to sort of trying to sculpt and fold the form as well. So once we worked out the opacity and the hole types and the best optimum holes at 500 meters and at 400 meters, and we did all these exhaustive tests at 1-to-1 and at scale and on digital, we sort of came up with the best solution and the best angle, the best fold, and then just from that sort of then led to this, which is basically, and what I was really, the thing I was most proud of and the thing I was most worried about from the beginning was making something heavier than when I started. And what I'm really pleased about is this piece ended up to 40% lighter than when we started. So it was a really, actually, we can sort of put hand on heart and say that actually it's a sort of green project, and rather than just sort of taking the money and just making something heavier, we've actually hopefully put the project more on track of what it should be, because it sort of lost sight of what it was trying to do, which was to save carbon. And so now the wind can pass through it. It's got a much more efficient frame, and it took a lot of design hours, but not much less materials. Excuse me. So this is the. I just wanted to show you the end bit of this film, because so this, you can see the way that it's optically affecting itself, changing with the light. So if I just zoom forward, and then the anodized surface also is very one of the really amazing things about the peninsula, which was again like a real sort of godsend in terms of being able to make this. It faces east to west, but it also has this. It's a big kind of bend in the river, so you get this a little bit like New York, which is this wonderful reflected light of the sea, and you're in the middle of Manhattan, and you have this incredible light, and it's because you have the skyscrapers are uplit from the sea and from the Hudson, and similarly the peninsula has this potential to have this incredible uplight, where you get this almost like a studio light coming up off the building. So this light here is the sunset hitting the silver building from the water, so you get this incredible pinks, and there's nothing digital there, but it's just. But I just wanted to show you this last. So here, this is where you see the sun setting through it. So you get this thing where it kind of melts away. So it sort of feels like this, almost like an industrial lace, and you get all this moire. But it's quite different when you see it in the flesh. But it's because you lose a bit with the resolution. But here you see how it solidifies again, and then it sort of disappears. So you get this it's kind of very dynamic. And then so we made a much purer form of it, which is one which has no constraints. There's no flues inside it. It's just a 6 meter, so 21-foot monolith that has it's just about creating this skin. So at first it feels like some strange sort of alien in the middle of this natural environment. But from one side it becomes very solid, and then from the other it kind of melts away when the sun sets behind it. So it's all about the differential of light. So it's this sort of, and at first I quite like it to feel like almost the first impression of it is something that's quite industrial, like a piece of industrial sort of infrastructure, but then for it to become quite poetic and have this sort of much more sort of kind of metaphysical raison d'etre. This is just another piece that has come on from this language, which is called the Optic Labyrinth, and it's an immersive piece. So with those two pieces, it was only an external experience, and I really wanted to sort of be able to enter in between the optic effects, these disruptive surfaces. So we developed this kind of honeycomb labyrinth, which was in Regent's Park this summer. And it measures about sort of 30 feet by 30 feet by 20 feet tall. And it's a sort of modular system of cells that stack, and sort of you can build any sort of labyrinth or sort of space you like, really. But at first it looks very industrial and very sort of utilitarian. So it has this cloak of the rational. But actually, every panel is actually subtly different. So the orientation and the opacity and the moire effect in every panel is different. So it creates this very pattern-rich. So at first, while it appears to be austere, it actually becomes very sort of generous or very pattern-based as you walk through it and around it. And it's a kind of, I guess, it's a take on a sort of a Stonehenge. It's like it's sort of very much about the sun, and again, the lower the sun is, the more dramatic it becomes in terms of the way that it melts away and the patterns that you get. So it's very sort of holographic. I think I'm really interested in the moire because it's something that you don't necessarily notice until you're made aware of it. Your brain tries to block it out, and it's sort of everywhere. But it's a phenomena. It's not an illusion, and it's not a hallucination. Yet it sort of rests on this idea of it questions one's perception, and it makes one question the completeness of one's perception. So I'm just now going to finish with the splicing of these two ideas. So what I've taken is we've kind of sort of joined the paradigm series with the optics, and I was inspired to make this piece. I was a few years ago in a cemetery in Japan. And I was asked there's an amazing patron out there called Hideo Sawa, who's he owns 5 cemeteries in Japan, and he's commissioned so far two non-denominational chapels in Japan. The last one is by David Chipperfield, but he's trying to make these very beautiful kind of spaces in which to say goodbye, and which to mourn loss and disappearance. But they're not specific to any religion, but they're just these very, very Zen, contemplative spaces in which to enhance these rites of passage, which are sort of familiar to all of us, or inevitable to all of us, but in this very sort of augmented way, rather than a little bit like the Maggie centres we have in the UK. I don't know if you have them out here, this sort of sense of psychological architecture where you're really trying to support people in these sort of grim moments, instead of being told you're going to die with a sort of fluorescent neon buzzing above your head in a windowless room. You have it in a very sort of incredibly cerebral place where you have objects which stimulate neural pathways and different ways of thinking. So I was really interested in creating a sort of work for the cemetery, but the paradigm, the steel ones felt far too heavy and too solid and too visceral. And so I was really interested in trying to create a sort of piece that felt like smoke or something, or disappearance itself, or dematerialization. And so this sort of idea of trying to combine the geometry of the tetrahedron with this optic work. So when the sun sets behind this, it kind of disappears. It sort of melts away. So there's this sense of entropy. And so, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going through all these. This led onto some further sort of disruption and dissolution of the form, in that these new works called fractures are they're not using the optic effect, but they're in this new show that you kindly mentioned earlier, the show called After the Explosion, Before the Collapse. But they're almost like a sort of, they've got this ghost of the paradigm, but they're almost like a photograph of a light bulb once it's exploded, before it falls to the ground. So it's like these shards. So this is sort of moment, and it's all very much again about entropy and disappearance. But they have this sense that they could be a model of DNA or of an amino acid, but yet they contain this sense of expansion or entropy. So there is this time is somehow contained within them, even though so they're a sort of model of something rational, and yet they contain this sense of growth and time passing as well. So they kind of defy sort of interpretation, really, I hope. And this one is one that involves, again, this optic layers. So this feels almost like an optic nerve or something, some very sort of natural formation or something, but then yet very man-made. So again, it creates these interference patterns. These are all built in my studio in London. They're very, very intricate. We use a jewelry welder to sort of, with a microscope, to weld them together because they're so tiny. And then this is the array of the show that shows this sort of this field array, similar to the last show that I did, but with this new kind of geometry and complexity. And then just again exploring the form in terms of a black and a mirrored and a rusty. So there's this sense of comparing and contrasting these, then seeing the similar form but expressed differently, and just how different the meaning is when you see them in these different ways. Yeah, so this one is this is a piece that kind of, it's a kinetic piece. So I'm just returning to a couple of kinetic pieces at the end. That this one is the sort of culmination of all our research at the moment into the interference patterns, and this one takes a sort of particular, very specific equation or algorithm. And there are two disks which rotate in opposite direction to each other. And this is a sort of study it's hanging in the window of the show in Victoria Miro in London, but it's basically a non-repeating sort of pattern which swirls and eddies around. It's called Murmuration Sequence, after the complex movement of birds against the sun, like starlings and things. But it takes about 8 minutes to repeat itself. But on one hand, it looks like a petri dish of amoeba. On the other, it could be some sort of plate from the Hubble telescope or something. So there's this ambiguity of scale that is sort of, we're playing with there. I mean, this one's only sort of 5 feet across, but I imagine this being really, really huge, and being a sort of massive tondo or round window in a building, or even just a tilting disc in a public space. So this is the sort of just an animation of the same thing. These things are completely replicatable digitally. I mean, I choose not to make, all my work is very much in the analog, made in the analog. We use a lot of digital techniques to prove and to demonstrate things, but everything is sort of these very visceral machines or systems within an increasingly sort of digital world. But this, basically shows you this kind of just the sort of unpredictability of this pattern. And finally, I'm just going to end with this is a piece that I have at the Wadsworth Athenaeum that's open till Sunday. So it's this show that I have on in Connecticut, in Hartford. Oops, sorry. And it's they also have the optic monolith outside for a few years, so it's on the front lawn of the museum, which is fantastic. So it's been lent on a long-term loan. This piece sort of it's a nice piece to finish on anyway, because it's a piece inspired by a scientist called Dorothy Hodgkin, who pioneered a process called crystal radiography. And she and essentially in Luddite terms, it's like you shine a laser through an amino acid that's smaller than the wavelength of light, and you essentially project its shadow onto the wall, and from that you infer its shape. And it's a very long-winded, very, very laborious process. And she described that process as like trying to work out the structure of a tree by only seeing its shadow. So it fits in very much with the Dappled Light of the Sun piece that I made earlier, where you're sitting under the oak tree and you're trying to work out the complexity of the bark and the leaves and the ants and everything, and you're never really going to be able to ever do that. And similarly with this one, the basic premise of this piece is that there's a sort of a rhombic cube in the space, and there are two lights which are moving in a very simple straight line from one corner of the cube to the other. And if you could only see the walls, would you ever be able to get back to this platonic object in the center? And that's the sort of the premise of this piece, the sort of the question. And I think that's in conclusion, I think one of the things I like to do here is you're placed as the viewer in this room as in a sort of almost like a Platonic or a God's eye position, where you can experience both the walls and the Platonic object in the center, and it's sort of I don't know whether you would ever be able to, as if you could only see the walls, whether you'd ever be able to get back to the object and understand it in its entirety. But I think as artists and also as scientists, we're trying to sort of see beyond the visible, to represent the invisible, and see beyond our perceptive envelopes in ingenious ways. So I think that art and science have this massive sort of bridge in common, or this overlap in common, in that we are, trying to represent the invisible in sort of effective and in effective ways that sort of I think, sorry. Okay. Sorry, that was a bit of a bad sentence at the end, but yeah, so, yeah, it's, I think that's it. Great. I think my jet lag is slightly catching up on me at the end there. Okay. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer anything. Yes. How do we work them out, or how do we? Well, they're all quite different, but the one in Philadelphia was it was shipped in dozens and dozens of pieces, and we had to erect the stem. The stem was built by the oil industry in Yorkshire, in Sheffield, and we sort of had to erect that in a number of modular pieces. And I used to have a studio on the second floor of a textile factory, and we had a small crane that came out of the window and sort of lowered things down over the street. But it was actually it was a bit of a nightmare, but it was a really good exercise in making things in modular, small ways that could always fit outside the door and fit in the boot of your car or the trunk of your car. So it was kind of a good, I mean, it was a good discipline to get used to. So we sort of have to build things in quite a pragmatic way, but it's really like a building. You have to just be very rational and create method statements and work it also. But the engineering is really important, because, like the dappled light of the sun, people are playing underneath it. It's you've got to do lots of wind testing and earthquake testing and all sorts of stuff. So it's really important to get it all right. Yeah. I have done a bit, but it's a real bastard to. You can't. I mean, you can't. There's nothing harder than titanium, so you can't actually fettle it in any way. There's nothing. You can't grind it or polish it. Or we have tried to do some stuff in it. Actually, because a titanium company invited us to try and make something out of their material, but it was just almost impossible. It's a really difficult material, because in order to polish something, you have to have something harder than it, and it is by definition the hardest thing in the world, I think. So you can't change it once it's. You can melt it down, but you can't polish it or change or weld it very easily. Yeah.
And I just have another follow-up. I noticed that everything seems to follow a real angular pattern. Have you ever thought of doing something circular?
Well, I do have. I haven't shown it today. There are quite a lot of. There's a whole other series of works which follow on from those light sculptures with the toroidal knots, which are all about harmonics in music, and they're called Manifolds and Perpetual chords. But you can see them on my website. But they're a very different beast, in that they are very very curvaceous and very they're these very flowing kind of what I call splines. They're sort of pathways that contain speed. So they're sort of, but they're a very different work. There isn't this sort of kind of austere sort of geometry or kind of tough geometric form aesthetic. There's a manifold in Hartford actually that you can see in Connecticut if you want. Yeah.
You talked about your love of Monet, and I just wondered if you could expand on that.
Well, I would describe Monet as a sort of in a category as similar to sort of Carl Andre or Sol LeWitt, in that I think I sort of regard him as a rule-based artist, and that he was quite scientific in this approach to always going back to the same subject at the same time of day, and seeing just this changing, like a scientist will just change keep a control, and then just change one iteration each time. And by doing that repetition, you get to this sort of higher plane of understanding, and it sort of becomes, they just completely break down as sort of into this semi-abstract or almost completely abstract sort of works. And so there is this thing where you're sort of getting beyond the real, and there is this sort of higher plane which they seem to reach. But I think it's through that rigorous kind of exploration of just changing just tweaking one thing each time, and it having this incredible effect. And I think that's the same with, I know that some people might not see that, but I think that I would love to do a show where you have a series of Monets and a series of Carl Andres on the floor or something, which show all these different iterations, and because I think they're the same kind of mind, even though they couldn't be further away from each other aesthetically. They seem to convey the same kind of approach to me. Yes.
Two parts. Has anyone described your work to you as spiritual? And if not, how would you respond to someone now defining spiritual?
That would be totally fine. I don't want to. They are meant to be. They're meant to be quite austere and very. There's this sort of, these machines have this. We really try and make them as rational and as well designed as possible, so they have this authority of the machine or of the mechanism. So one of the reasons I moved away from using wood was because I didn't want there to be this whimsy or this kind of sense of a sort of Heath Robinson or the kind of mad inventor. I want them to exist as, and if you were to see them outside of the context of the art gallery, I want people to think, what does that do? What is that for? I want there to be that archaeological sort of energy. And actually, when we were installing that piece in the window, the Murmuration Sequence, we were sort of trying to get the height right, and this guy walked past, and he was like, "What's that for? What is that?" And the technician said, "Oh, it's an artwork," and he was like, "Oh, right," and just walked off. So it kind of immediately gave him the excuse to not be interested anymore. And I think there's this almost, they're quite disingenuous. There's this cloak of the rational to hide a sort of metaphysical or poetic or, if you like, spiritual kind of heart, and you're absolutely entitled to that. And I don't want to have control of the meaning of these works. I have specific reasons why I made them, but every one of you in this room, hopefully, if it's a good work of art, will have a different, will take something away different from that, depending on your memories, your genetics, your experiences, and that I can't control that, nor would I want to. Yes.
You did a great collaboration with the choreographer Wayne McGregor at the Royal Ballet, based on Titian's Diana and Pantheon.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your interest in human geometry versus your interest in kind of molecular geometry. And also, that piece was very anthropomorphic. There was a dance between a robot and a human. And some of the pieces that you've been showing also feel quite anthropomorphic, some don't. And I wondered how important that is. If you talk a little bit about that sort of representational side.
So I've tried to sort of talk about these very specific things, but this was a really important project for me, where I was asked to respond to this a narrative-based figurative painting by petition. And as a sort of system-based abstract sculptor, I was very surprised to be asked. but I was really relished it. Again, it was a good example of being sort of taken outside one's comfort zone and really it making you a much stronger artist, a much sort of. So I really enjoy those sorts of constraints and those kinds of problems to solve. I came up with this idea that was sort of, I don't really know when the eureka moment was, but I interpreted Diana in this. I decided to portray Diana, who's this quite sensual Ovid, sort of from Ovid. She's this and goddess from the Greek mythology, but she's always depicted in this very kind of sensual way. She's an object of desire, and yet she has very little empathy. She's very tough on Actaeon, turns him into a stag for seeing her naked. She's very, very tough on Callisto, who is essentially a rape victim, and she turns her into a bear. So she's got this kind of lack of empathy. She's very callous, but at the same time she's this sort of this independent woman, and she's very sort of this object of desire, and this very early example of a sort of lesbian independent woman, and so she's very interesting, very powerful figure, and I sort of decided to cast her as this 6-axis robotic arm that was this thing I came across in a carving studio, in a fabrication studio, and my first reaction when I saw this robot was it was a primeval emotion to do with like seeing a wild boar in a forest. Is this thing going to harm me? I stopped in my tracks and felt, is this machine going to harm me? Is this a threat to me? And then my second reaction was one of fear, because I felt threatened as an artist, because this thing was making something. It was carving a statue, and it made me feel that I had to change my position in terms of technology. But anyway, I sort of cast Diana as this piece of technology. So this uneasy relationship we all have with technology, and that we have become increasingly dependent, and yet we all are quite sort of terrified of it as well, and we don't know what the future holds. But the machine is very, very anthropomorphic, and essentially it's analogous to a human arm, and I have basically developed a whole choreographic system around this robot where we've got this wand with a light at the end. Again, you can see it all online, but it's essentially a choreographic instrument, but of course it has this anthropomorphic potential. But I'm very interested in the meaning of number, and the meaning of ratio, and the meaning of movement. The interpretation of movement is something that's very, very, I'm very preoccupied by. I'm very certain that certain movements mean something, but I'll never probably know what that is. I just know that my response is something that my brain, it's incredibly pleasing. It stimulates these kinds of thoughts and these neural pathways that's feels very pleasurable. And I think that's, I guess, one of the things why I make objects like this and I like to look at art, is when you see something beautiful, or you see something complicated, you see something that is beyond understanding, it does stimulate these new pathways in your brain that is so exciting. I think it's so sort of palpable, I talk about it in that way because I've got this new book that you mentioned earlier called Psychogeometries, and I came up with this. I thought I'd come up with this name for this book, Psychogeometry, and I looked it up on the internet, and it was actually coined in the 1930s by Maria Montessori, who was formed the Montessori schools, and she was this really pioneering woman from Spain, and she coined this term psychogeometry, and it's about how you can try and stimulate neural pathways in children before they have language by creating sequential shapes, colors, geometry, patterns, puzzles, and you confront these children with these systems, these systemic objects which need to fit together or not, or stack up, or colors that go together. And it's about stimulating neural pathways before you have language. And I was really pleased about this. It didn't feel like it was a contradiction, and we've obviously acknowledged her in the book. But it felt like this is really exactly what I'm sort of getting at a bit, that I see sort of geometry, and I see number, I see ratio, and I'm certain it sort of means something, and it stimulates parts of my brain that are sort of dark or haven't been sort of touched yet, and it just feels very healthy. And I don't think I'll ever sort of understand it fully, but it feels very sort of healthy and very good to be exploring those things, and just very good for the brain. So a very long answer.
Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. I'm wondering, if you scattered throughout your talk where you used words like rules and parameters, and in the end you sort of summarized things by saying you were very analog and not too digital in your approach. So are there mathematical models underlying? Do you simulate some of these objects, sculptures, before, stress test them, if you will, for their instability or
Yeah, I mean, we do, the studio is, hopefully we're sort of quite a good splice of very cutting edge modern digital techniques, but with also some very ancient or old school kind of analog ideas. I mean, so we're really, there is a lot, we do, these paradigms, and the one in the Foster building in Comcast could never really have been built without digital modeling. It's so irrational, and the angles and the geometry is really, really intense. And it even the most sort of powerful kind of computers really struggle to sort of hold the whole model in its grips, and we sort of had to break it up because it was crashing all the time. And it's very that they are really reliant, and the tetrahedron is so beguiling. It's got these projected angles, which it would have been very, very challenging to have made these works before computers. So while there's something very, very ancient and very sort of eternal about the geometry, we're able to mine it and sort of seam it through digital technology far more effectively, or probably without, I think probably it wouldn't have been possible before. Yeah.
Just an interesting follow-up. I saw a documentary on PBS about the construction of the Pantheon, and their point was that the Pantheon, using modern engineering and construction techniques, would not be built, even with computers. It would not be. You could not build it today, the way the Romans did, 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the Pantheon is the most extraordinary building in the world. It's probably my favorite building in the world in terms of the experience inside it, but also this sort of incredible sort of destroyed exterior, and then this sublime, perfect interior. I mean, it is a complete sort of wonder. I don't know the full extent of why it wouldn't be possible to build it now, but yeah, I mean, I'm sure you could. Yeah, I mean, I think surely the question is, how did they build it then, rather than we couldn't build it now? Because surely I think or you're saying there's a reason why we can't build it now? I think it's more the mystery is how they managed to build it then is the real question, because it is an extraordinary feat. Yeah. Great. Thank you.